Okay, Ron. Well, we're kind of starting the second part of our discussion on the heart or the human heart. And just for a reminder of everybody else, last time and even for us is that we kind of explored the theme of heart in the Bible, at least in not all of it. We didn't exhaust it, but obviously we kind of wanted to show that it's a significant and very important theme. It comes up, I think, 546 times in the Old Testament, and I can't recall off the top of my head, is 160 some odd times from the New. And really what we were trying to show is that God is obviously very concerned for the motivations and the condition of the human heart. And what we see in Jesus and Paul is that the heart is the locomotive, or in some ways the dictator of how we see the world, perceive the world, and the choices that we make. And so the condition of our heart will determine how we think, or even how we filter information from the outside. And all of our choices are always based by what our heart wants most. You do what's most important to you. Or as I was in Matthew 6 yesterday teaching and preaching, was you can't have two masters. You're devoted to the one, or you despise the other. You love the one, you hate the other. You either love God or you're devoted to money. But the point is that God is interested in single-minded or single-directed hearts, and you are either loving God or you're loving something else.
Yeah, and there's the effort, I think, that is a natural halfway effort that doesn't work. Mm-hmm. And I happen to read that in my reading of Isaiah, and I know mm-hmm. it's picked up in Mark 7 and elsewhere. Mm-hmm. Jesus complained, citing Isaiah, draw near me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. Mm-hmm. And I think for any of us who might be wrestling with whether this concept is sound or meaningful, I think we all have that when we know we've got people who say, oh, love you, really want to hang out with you, we'll talk to you soon. And you know that they mm-hmm. are just using those words mm-hmm. in a sloppy, careless way because they really don't have you high on their priority list.
Yeah.
And I think that in a practical way, we live with a sense of where another person's heart is at, but we don't tend to articulate it. And that's really what we're trying to do here, say, no, actually the Bible treats that as central, even though we're conscious of it in all of our relationships, by not putting it out on the table and carving it a little bit and saying, what exactly is this made of? We end up being naive, I think, and a little silly for thinking that our rationality is the key to who we are, when really it's our responsiveness. In fact, it was interesting that in my working with trying to understand some of the ancient figures that I worked on in my studies over the years, the guy that really helped me was Augustine from, we'll just say he lived roughly around 400. That's where his core work was being done. 390 to whatever, 420 some when he died. And I did these circles and comparisons between Stoicism and what I thought was the best way of describing what Augustine was doing. Should we jump into that, Dave? And take a look?
I'll as I pull up the PowerPoint here, two thoughts did come to mind while you were talking, Ron, which is first is what you're thinking about, talking about priorities, and this is something we could probably use and come back to, is as we're recording this, we're right smack in 4 weeks or 5 weeks of the shelter in orders. And
for any of you that are post-COVID and watch these, just remember what those days were like.
We're right. And what there's memes going around, but I'm hearing this even from other people, is people are discovering their real priorities. They no longer have excuses of busyness. Obviously there's many people who are still working, but there are many people who are at home, and they like, oh yeah, I clean my house, but that's because but I'm busy, and I've discovered that's a lie. And even what people are discovering is, oh yeah, I would say I'd read my scriptures, but I'm so busy with life. I'm starting to discover that I've been home for 4 weeks and I found everything else to do but be in the scriptures. And so I'm starting to discover that maybe my priorities are all out of whack. And because that means my values of my heart are focused on something else. And so, as we think about these things, I just think, well, yeah, man, what you're talking about priorities, what we do is what's most important to us. And now some of the busyness of life can no longer be used as excuses to not do do what we think is important. So these excuses, oh, I love you, but I have other things. Not anymore. Like, you have time to call your long lost friend or your relatives that are far away, and all that kind of stuff. So here we go. And I'll pull up this. And what you're talking about, Ron, is that and the other thought as I'm pulling this up is the notion that how do I want to say it? That I had it and then I was pulling. Oh, here, this isn't a very, like I think you put it in your PhD that what we're going to be talking about is spiritual anthropology, or technically faculty psychology. It tends to be an opaque and fairly boring and dense topic. And yet even someone like Dallas Willard, who his conclusions are ones that we may not want to affirm, but he does posit that the second most important question of life is, what does it mean to be human? Because if we don't know who we are, we don't know what salvation actually is. And so we're might see that we're going to go into Aristotle and Stoicism and kind of opaque subjects. It really is to explore, what does it mean to be human in light of who God is, and therefore what is the gospel, what is this problem the gospel solves, and then how does this impact my life? So these are vitally important assumptions that no one seems to be talking about, and yet you go back to the days of the Protestant Reformation, or even the 5th century with Augustine. These are the central subjects that they're wrestling with in order to live out the gospel.
Just a comment too along that line is that what I was forced to do in my studies is I was loving the Puritans and trying to apply them to the Bible and see how they used the Bible, and saw the comparison between the love of God and the sense of duty as two divisions among the Puritans, is I recognized how much philosophy really does play a role in our thinking. Whether we know it or not, we swim in philosophical content. Mm-hmm. It's just that no one is putting their finger on the assumptions or the ideas that have been defined by Aristotelian or Platonic or even Socratic thinking, and other figures too, Stoicism, Zeno, Seneca, and others, who, if we start to quote them and what they've said, you'll go, oh, I recognize that, even though it's not attached to the names. And so I was just sitting here thinking of, as you were sharing your point, that a man, Socrates, who was the teacher of Plato, and Plato was the teacher of Aristotle, and they're all living in the 300s before Christ. He said, the unexamined life, Socrates did, is not worth living. Mm-hmm. And I think that's exactly where we would say and agree with the philosophers. At least they were trying to examine life to find out, what is it that makes life worth living? And that's the gospel content that we're offering as we are Christians taking the Bible to the world. Not to say Dave and I have a corner on this gospel truth. We're just saying that's our pursuit. And that's why I hope any viewers here are engaging with us to say, oh, I'm going to agree with you lock, stock, and barrel. We're not asking for that. We're just saying, examine life, and let's we're going to offer to you some of the things that we've chased here and found the Bible chasing in our own lives, to try and find out, what is the examined life? Where are we at? What is really valuable?
And just to add this too, is that Greek philosophy is Greek theology. The philosophers.
No, wait a second. Philosophy and theology are two different worlds, aren't they?
No, the same ambitions. They are trying to understand life in light of a higher being.
You mean to say a philosopher who actually has a single God shaping everything that they believe is different than a Christian who has a triune communing God as the basis for everything they believe?
Yeah.
are really two different versions of living life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow.
Well, the
What a thought.
philosophers were, as you know, Ron, the philosophers were essentially Greek monks. The philosopher would with their reason, the starting point, philosophy starts with reason, observes creation, that the reason that, and the will that God has given them, observes it, determines who God is. That is, God is, as we'll see, pure mind and pure will, or pure act, as Aristotle would say. Plato comes to different conclusions, but still God is a monadic being, if you want to say that. And so they say, well, God is like this, God is orderly, God is all powerful, and all these kinds of things. And therefore, now we must live life and make choices to pursue what is just, what is virtuous. And this is the happy life, living a virtuous life. And
So you would not be able to say then that Aristotle, Plato, Socrates, we could name a few other philosophers, Zeno, Seneca,
Marcus Aurelius.
yeah, that they would not have a heart after God's heart necessarily.
No.
Or their heart would be after the God that they have, who is heartless.
Yeah. And they would see themselves as living a more pure, holy, rigorous life than everybody else.
Right. So that in effect, they became the measure of other people.
Yeah. Yeah. And they would be seen as the spiritual people. Now, it got Socrates killed, and so it's not, there hasn't been necessarily pushback on some of these issues, but just to say is that philosophy isn't benign to spiritual life. And so they view humanity utterly different than how Jesus and defines humanity, or the human heart, or how Paul talks about, or just in general, the whole of Scripture, in light of, because God is a triune being. And so even humanity is different. Where if, as we'll look at the, we can start on this, Ron, that we can see the dotted line here. And I think you can see my arrow, but the dotted line here is basically the upper faculties here, mind and will. These are divine faculties, because God doesn't have a body. And so he's pure mind, he's pure will. As I usually think of it, God is a big brain with a mighty arm, with a mirror focused on himself, because God is most focused upon himself, this Aristotelian unmoved mover. And so therefore, humanity is basically divine in the sense they have the image of God, which is primarily reason, and the capacity to make good choices. The will wants to do good. The mind always thinks of good. And so they make choices that are good. The only problem is we are different than God, is that we've been enfleshed. We have these pesky, fleshy affections or passions or desires. And
just
they
to
are
comment on
bad.
that, Dave, just to comment that the philosophers would recognize the affections as being appetites. So that was a common term that was used by the early philosophers, the appetitive features that we would have.
Because God's not hungry, right?
Body appetites are where the notion of desires or affections come from. And that's why the negative associated with that. So just to give another word there.
And why is that? Because God doesn't have thirst. He isn't hungry. He isn't. He doesn't feel pain, and so on and so forth, because he doesn't have body. He's not. He's infinite. We're finite because of so on and so forth.
So the trick is to climb out of, and it's a notion that a group called the Gnostics really believed, that spirit is good, physical is bad. The affections are part of our physical existence. To climb into genuine spirituality is to deny or suppress or condemn anything physical, which fits a lot of current disciplines, the idea of going out and having vast fasts and living in a desert, for instance, the desert monks.
Well, or I mean, you could be maybe more feisty, Ron, accountability groups.
I didn't want to say that, but it could be
that.
But
not to say that, like if you're an alcoholic and you have a sponsor who helps you walk the path and understands where you're going, that we're not saying that, but I'm talking about the weekly men's accountability group, which is, hey, did you read your Bible this week? And, how is it going with your wife? And that we set up more rules that are just for us in order to make right choices, and we're going to keep you accountable. And you're going, well, is that really reflective of this idea? Because isn't there maybe another issue? It's not that
Let
you
me
don't
just
read.
suggest that that you're raising a point that is controversial, and I think we
Yeah,
could have some people just run away from us and say,
that's
you
true.
guys are absurd for
Yeah,
making these comments. I think what we want to do is say, let's just gently explore different ways of viewing how the soul operates, and
yeah,
then we can make this critique a little more.
yeah. That's true. We probably do that.
Yeah.
Well, then let's just look at this, Ron, so you can see, and this chart as is, because you're the primary former of it, but there's that red dotted line again that God you have a point here. God equals mind and will. So to be godly ourselves, we must control our unreliable affections or appetites. And the mind and the will do this by joining together against our feelings to apply godly virtues, which then form a godly character that God can embrace.
And I think the line there, just under the big bold white introductory line there, is that these are three mutually interactive motivational centers. And so that's the key to this.
Yeah.
Again, you mentioned it before, faculty psychology is what it was called during the Puritan era. The idea that the mind and will are in conversation with each other about what to do with the affections, and the person who is weak lets their affections shape their thinking. So we have that arrow going from the affections to the mind. And the affections are trying to coerce the will into doing what the affections desire. And the mind and will have to team up together then to overcome the faulty affections.
Yeah.
And that's where this idea of accountability or discipline comes from. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, what it presumes, that's what I think my point was, is that information or education will then enable us to make right choices by being able to confront or dismiss or suppress the faulty appetites of the flesh. And so, and in some examples of people who affirm this moral psychology is that God has created us in this tension. The spirit-flesh tension is a created tension. That is, that here we have the spiritual things that God has created to enable us to have as the image of God. And this is the affections, are the flesh. And so God has created us as embattled beings. And now with the goodness that he's given us, we can suppress these things.
Set our
and make
mind
right
on the
choices.
spirit, not on the flesh. Yeah.
Yes. And you can prove Texas in the Bible without a problem in some ways.
Yeah. Be transformed by the renewing of our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, the truth is that this view is actually very common in just common sense thinking. This is how we think. We make choices, and we're free to make choices. And so there are competing things within me that I experience to make these choices. But one of the issues that the Protestants, or the Protestant movement, let's say Luther, found was, wait a minute, this doesn't really fit with it, because it's a sense of a moral neutrality. I'm morally neutral, and the choices that I make determine who I am. But as I'm wrestling with in Matthew 7, for instance, Jesus says, no, you're either a good tree or a bad tree. Good trees produce good fruit, bad trees produce bad fruit. You're born dead in your trespasses and sins, as it says in Ephesians 2. So I would assume that means you're born a bad tree. And even Jesus says a righteous tree will only produce righteous fruit once it's been transformed and been made righteous. And so this doesn't fit very well with that assumption, because there's a sense that somehow a willed being can produce and make right choices and then become a good tree by making right choices over time.
And the assumption that Aristotle in particular, with what we call virtue ethics, is argued. And I just read that constantly. I was just reading some very highly, a book here, Augustine on the Will. And even the early Augustine had this idea that morality is defined by the necessity to choose good in order to be good, or to
Mhm.
choose badly to be bad. That's what defines us morally, and God is somehow assisting us in the process of moving from choosing well to choosing, or badly to choosing well. And I think it would be useful just to pause for a second and say, so what is it to be dead spiritually? Because a lot of people will critique what we're talking about here as being pessimistic.
Mm.
So it's, you're
Yep.
pessimistic, we're optimistic, you've got a bad view of the human soul, we've got a more positive view,
Mhm.
you think we're dead in our sins, we think we're sick, you know, that sort of thing. And you go,
Yep.
well, you better go back to Genesis 3 and decide where you're going to land
Mhm.
on the argument in Genesis 3. You will die, you will not die.
Hmm.
And Jesus with Nicodemus, you're dead, I am not dead. You know, so what? How can I be dead? Well, you
Yeah.
have to be born again. And I
Well,
think
even First John too, like, you know, you're either the son of God or you're the son of the devil. There are no, you
yeah.
know, you either seek the one or you hate the one. You can't, or
So I
love the
think
one, hate
it's
the one. You
helpful
can't.
for me to pose this, and I'll just
Mhm.
pose this to for any of you who are thinking with us, but going, I still have got a gap here in what you're talking about. To recognize that the Spirit of God is the source of life. He's the Spirit of life within us. And we'll be talking about our theology of participation, that we're united with Christ. Well, what happens with Adam and Eve is they declare independence from God, and they want to come out from under God, and that's what they're invited to do, and to not overwhelm God. They're ready to recognize they've talked to him, they've been in relationship with him, they've been in the garden with him. They just are becoming, moving out from under his supervision. They want to be like God. They want to be parallel to God. They want to be able to choose right and wrong, recognizing God is greater. But in fact, what they did is they lost their source of life. And in that's what it is to be dead. It's to be out from the source of life, and now to be independent, autonomous. So that's what we're really saying, is the Spirit is the source in John 3 of having that life, and that comes only through our union and communion. So they grieved and quenched the Spirit, and now we're talking about people who do not have the Spirit of God, the Spirit of life dwelling within them. So just to make that point.
And Luther, in his disputation against scholastic theology, which is kind of his first salvo of, I think, the Protestant movement. So is that September 4th, I think, 1517?
Yeah. Weeks before the 95 Theses that we think of so often as the starting point.
And he says there that no one wants God to be God, but in fact, we want to be God. And therefore, what he's saying is, and he builds off of that Matthew 7 and Augustine, which is that we're not morally neutral. So we are not free to choose between two opposites, good and evil, and how we choose will determine who we are. We're either evil or we're good. We're either the sons of God or we're the sons of the devil. And
to say sons of the devil, it can still be some people who are altruistic, living in what seems to be a very good lifestyle.
The Pharisees, right? I mean, they're religious. They appear to be good. They're living successful lives in a lot of ways.
Even Peter, when Peter condemns Jesus for the idea that he's going to be crucified, and he says, no, Jesus, you cannot go to Jerusalem to be crucified. This is just after Peter has declared that Jesus is the Messiah.
Yeah.
And Jesus has to say, get behind me, Satan, for you're thinking in the ways of man, not in the ways of God. So I think what we're not trying to do is say that people are living demonized lives.
No.
Caricature it by the movies. We're simply saying, if someone is out from under God, saying, not my will, but not your will, but my will be done on this occasion. Today, I'm just going to do what I want to do. Lord, I know that wouldn't please you, but I just want to do it because, you know, it's no harm done. Well, the answer is yes, harm is done. Anything that's not of faith is sin.
Yeah.
And so that's what we're
even
really talking about.
I think of basically we're using good in two different ways. Good for the thinking of the rich young ruler that comes to Jesus and says, good teacher, you know, how do I have eternal life? And Jesus says, why do you call me good? No one's good but God. And
Or
then,
you
so there's,
take you blend together a couple of the texts. Another one of the texts, the parallel text there says, "Good teacher, what good things must I be doing?" So the idea is goodness is somehow something that floats in the air, and if we accumulate it, then we become good. Yeah.
So we're saying the standard of biblical good is God. Now, when we say that's a good person, we're not equating them as being in the sense of morally godly and in relationship with them. But you could see a philosopher, let's say Aristotle, appeared to live a good, righteous, virtuous life. And so, but in the categories that the Bible is offering, he wouldn't be in the category of the sons of God.
He's certainly not under the living triune God. He's out here trying to say, here's how we can live separately with the notion of a singular God that we will then align ourselves with. Yeah.
Yep. And so Luther, his part of his discovery of the gospel is, and what Melanchthon and many, let's say, scholars since have said, the very center, even Luther said this to himself in the bondage of the will when he's speaking to Erasmus, the very thing that his entire theology, even his message of justification by faith, hinged upon this heart-centered anthropology, that we're not morally neutral, we're responders. We're either going to respond to the truth and the love of God being poured out into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, or we're going to be responsive to the enemy, the world, and the values of the world and the flesh. And so our hearts are responsive to those things, and whatever we value and worship, that will determine the quality of our heart. So if we're captured by the world and the flesh and the enemy, or the love of self, we are ungodly. But if we're captured by God and his beauty and love him and live, like Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 5, to please him, and the love of God Christ compels me, controls me, well, that is a heart that's responsive to the Spirit, and therefore is righteous and holy, or the Son of God. And so then what, here thinking of, even kind of reverse this, that the heart is the center of the affections and all motives, and the mind is really just a processor. It processes what we want. It justifies what we want, maybe even filters out certain information that we don't want to see in order to then make our choices. So as Luther would say, no, the will isn't free, it's bound by the heart. And Calvin had a similar debate with Albert Pagius, another Dutchman, a Catholic Dutchman, and he basically affirmed and said the same thing. So this is at the very center of how we speak of the good news that we celebrate in Jesus.
Yeah, we're kind of tossing in a mishmash a lot of things here. Why don't we use our little chart here to unpack it?
Go for it, Ron. Go for it.
Notice what we've done here in this alternative, we're calling it the alternative biblical view of the soul, is that we start with Proverbs 4, watch over your heart with all diligence, for from it flow the springs of life. And what it's really doing is saying the heart is the well of everything that comes forward in us. And so what we've done there in the bottom, in the red print, almost wish that was bright yellow or something, just so it would stand out a little bit better. The single center of the motives. In other words, we're not dealing with three motivational centers as in the earlier Aristotelian model, Stoic model of how the soul operates that's widespread among us today. We would say there's only a single center where motives are located. So that the mind is not a motivational center. We put it over there on the right-hand side. You'll see the line dividing there as instrumental. That is, these are merely instruments, with the mind coaching the choice center where we make our actions, our choosing, as what we will do, and why we do it is because of something in the heart. And so that's why Jesus is forever examining. We tend to examine choices and say, the choices are the key to who we are. Yeah, that's a little bit like saying, yeah, I'm doing things, but I don't want to have anyone examine my motives. And so the language of defining motives over against behaviors is all that this chart is reflecting. And that the mind is sitting here waiting for the heart to give it a sense of what the values are
Mm-hmm.
that the mind needs to process. So we recognize the processing that goes on in our heads. Let me think about that, we'll say.
Mm-hmm.
Or what we're really going to say, I wonder what I feel. I need to have my heart inform me. Do I want a red car, blue car, green car, yellow car? Which color do I prefer? The heart needs to inform the head to say, we're going to go with a blue car because we love lakes that are blue. We love sky that is blue. I was given some clothing that was blue and I really liked it. Whatever it is, we just may have a preference for blue, but that's a heart issue. And the mind is waiting for that information to help the choosing, the going and buying the car, opening the door, getting into it, driving it away. It comes out of the heart, ultimately to the head, and then into the actions.
Yeah, and
That's
so
who we are.
yeah, and so and what basically, again, to make this, is who or what our hearts are most attracted to, what we love the most, is going to determine what we do. And so, for instance, I may have a great desire to say, I want to lose 20 pounds. But I also have a sweet tooth, and I particularly like Sour Patch Kids. And so if I go and pick up a bag of Sour Patch Kids and eat them, what that is saying is that, yeah, while you may want to lose some weight, you really, really want Sour Patch Kids more.
Are
than
you
you want to
messing
lose
with my devotion to banana cream pies? Is that what you're doing?
Yeah, banana cream pies are, it's like I should read. I'll be really, just well, we were talking about priorities and people discovering them, stuck at home. I really do love the Bible and I want to be in the Bible, but maybe 3 more episodes of this series that I'm streaming and binging. What actually, like, well, I think I actually love entertaining myself more than whatever it is that
Until I talk to a pastor, and then I don't want to bring that up.
Yeah, but you see, like, there's so yeah, and I'm anticipating in some ways Melanchthon says something similar to this, and Philip
Can I
Melanchthon
read
is,
that to you? I
yeah, go
actually
ahead.
have it sitting here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. But if you think of the power of the human will as a capacity of nature, and by the way, I want to make it clear here, this is Luther, Martin Luther, being expressed through his 23-year-old mentoree. So he's really articulating what Luther would say in his own writings in a much more complex and less easy to read model.
Where do you have it? Which page are you reading from?
That's 26, page 26. A less readable fashion in Luther's Bondage of the Will. But let me rethink of the power of the human will as a capacity of nature, according to human reason. It cannot be denied that there is in it a certain freedom of outward works. And so just the decision of whether to greet someone, what to put on, those external behaviors seem to be the will, the freedom of the will. But he says, actually, that doesn't capture the real issues. So point 2 there. By contrast, the internal affections are not in our power, for by experience and habit, we find that the will cannot in itself control love, hate, or similar affections, but affection is overcome by affection. And so that the real battle is the motivational battle in the circle that we drew in our chart, for instance, where you have the world, the flesh, and the devil drawing us into desires that we've cultivated over the years, and those have become habitual desires. But the alternative to those desires is for the Spirit of God pouring the love of God into our hearts by the Holy Spirit, and that's in Romans 5:5, and it's something that Augustine, from whom I drew this chart reading his material, says, ultimately it is God's love that captures us. And so Paul in 2 Corinthians 5 talks about the love of Christ compelling us and shaping our choices and desires once he is present in us. Same thing in John 3 to Nicodemus. Nicodemus, you have to have the Spirit of God within you, who is the one who pours out the love of God in our hearts, and so on. So what we have here is an illustration then that Melanchthon is ready to offer here when he says, okay, let's use the language of love. It's true that we are driven by what we love, whether we acknowledge it or not. That's what shapes our motivation. So, for instance, because you were betrayed by one you loved. So think of a broken relationship. Maybe in your high school days, you thought you loved someone or someone loved you, and you just were inflamed in this relationship. Yet you cease to love, for you love yourself more ardently than anyone else. And so his point is, okay, you love this person for a time, and then you walked away from that relationship. Guess who you really loved in that relationship? Yourself. You were devoted to yourself, and this person was just a good stir that kept you going for a while, and then you moved on to a new love. And so the one that you really loved in moving from one love relationship to another is yourself. And the way I kind of illustrate that is having love that has got hooks in it. And as long as the mutual benefits of that love relationship work, that's great. But real love, God so loved the world that he gave himself, doesn't have hooks in it. It's just sort of God is ready to give himself, but we then resist the love of God in our self-love, curling in on ourselves. So just some illustrative stuff in what Melanchthon is saying here. Comment?
Well, I don't know. I was just going to go on to the next sentence for nothing. It said, now
Yeah.
hunger and thirst, but he redefines and makes the point that we are making, which is heart seems to be in the scriptures, for the scriptures call the most powerful part of the heart, or of man, the heart, especially that part in which the affections arise. But the schools, that is the academics, are in error when they imagine the will by its very nature opposes the affections, or that it is able to lay an affection aside whenever the intellect so advises or warns. So he's saying he's just rejecting that first model that we were showing and saying the Bible's affirming the second model that we're showing, and that we've shown. And there isn't a way to make choices or think that then can affect our affections. As you've mentioned many times, it's unidirectional. It's a one-way street. You can't feel love or love something by acting loving, and then therefore all of a sudden I love, or I can have certain knowledge in my head and then it somehow seeps down 18 inches to my heart and then it becomes real.
It's interesting, Dave, and you and I have taught some of this content over the years, that I'll find someone will criticize the model that we just said that has the direction going from the heart to the mind, to the choosing, the will. And they'll say, no, it really does go back and forth between the mind and the heart.
Yeah.
And I'll say, no, what really is going on, and that's, we could read that just in a moment here, in Melanchthon. What's really going on is it's affection versus affection that's going on, and that the mind is waiting for the affections to go forward. So let's read that next section.
Number 3?
Yeah.
Go for it.
How does it happen then that we men often choose something different than what we are disposed to? So that's the big question. Why is it that, hey, wait a second, I was committed to one thing and now I've moved to another? And first, because in an external act, we sometimes choose something different from that which the heart or will, he's basically using the heart and will as the one same thing, desires. So it is possible for affection to overcome affection. For instance, it cannot be denied that Alexander of Macedon was a lover of pleasures, but because he was more zealous for glory, he spurned pleasures. This is Alexander the Great. He spurned pleasures and chose hard work, not because he did not love pleasures, but because he loved glory with more intensity. And so it is that by the time he was 33 years old, Alexander the Great had conquered the entire known world by driving himself and his troops beyond measure. And that's what Melanchthon is attributing here to self-love, even though the man was given over to passions. If you read the story of Alexander the Great, the greatest passion he had was for his own glory.
Well, and
So,
that just reminds me of just even the end of John chapter 12, where Jesus says or John is giving commentary on why people continually reject Jesus, and that is that they love the glory that comes from man rather than the glory that comes from God, because the glory that comes from God in John chapter 12 leads to the cross and death and giving one's life that others may have life, or to give up your life that you may have life. And so there's a reason why people reject Jesus, and because they don't want to enter into the light that he's offering.
And it's interesting because the language that the Bible will use here, Jesus talks in John 8, he says, no one can serve two masters. You're going to love the one and hate the other, serve the one, despise the other. So that's the Matthew passage. Now let me go to the John 8 passage. There he's saying, no, if you're truly my disciples, you'll abide my word, you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free. So that seems to be a cognitive driven sort of thing. And he goes on to say, here's the issue. If you're not someone who's abiding in my word, it's because you don't actually have a heart for my word. He doesn't use that language, but he says, if God were your father, you would love me. And as it is, you do the desires of your father, the devil. So it's a battle again of the affections. It's which affection am I following? And so he talks about that as being enslaved to sin, enslaved to the desires of the one he goes on in John 8 to talk about as the liar. There's no truth in him. Whenever he speaks literally in the Greek, the lie. And you go, well, I don't think I believe the lie. And the answer is, well, if you have moved out from under God, you are believing the lie that you can be like God. And that ultimately is the touchstone issue. Same thing in Romans, where it talks about you were once obedient slaves in chapter 6 of Romans to the flesh, and it was death that controlled you. And then he says in verse 17, 6:17, but thanks be to God, you who were once slaves of sin have become obedient from the heart to the standard of teaching to which you were committed. And having been set free from sin, you have become slaves to righteousness. Wow. So actually what we do is we find ourselves connected either by our union with Christ to the love that God has, and then he carries that into our hearts by pouring it out into our hearts. We respond to the Spirit, or we're captured by the love the enemy is drawing us into, which are the satisfying of our affections and ambitions.
And Luther would say that connection in humanity or the realm of death and darkness can appear as vice, or it can appear as virtuous, because choices aren't the reason. Even Jesus says this in Matthew 6, it's why you do what you do is far more important than what you do. God is concerned about the motivations and the intentions and the dispositions of the heart.
And I can't even sort those out myself. We talked about that last week, or last time we talked here.
So we're not morally, we're dependent upon him, and therefore, in a sense, again, responsive beings. We respond to outside stimuli, and so therefore we're not I'll keep on saying, we're not morally neutral. And this is so important, because we think that it's natural and it's common sense, and we're constantly taught this, is that what you do and how you do it habitually, that will make you that person. So if I'm a good person practicing good deeds over a period of time, therefore I become a good person. That's the rich young ruler's assumption when he comes to Jesus in Mark 10, and I can't recall the other place, the other synoptic places, but in Mark 10, that's clearly the assumption is that I do good things, I get eternal life. That makes me a good person. I go out and shoot free throws every day and practice, I become a good free throw shooter and maybe even a good basketball player. But in the reality is that those actions don't, all they do is reflect the motivation of the heart, and they may not be pure, and they may not be, or they may be. You just never know. That's the point.
Here's a point that I want to make now, because we're going to have to wrap this up. Some of the listeners, viewers, may be saying, well, you guys are rushing us to go back into stuff historically distant.
Yes.
No one today believes anything that you're saying. To be honest with you, you're really out of touch with current reality.
Yeah.
Well, let me just say, it depends on what your reading sources are. Let me just offer one book, for instance.
Yeah.
If any of you want to look at this in a more complex way, there's plenty of books that I've got on my bookshelf that talk about the function of the affections.
Yeah.
In fact,
you should pull up the neurologists as well. I mean, not only just in theology, but neurology. Antonio Damasio, I can never say his name right. What is it?
Damasio, yeah.
Damasio, that's it. And
who's
says
now
the same
USC.
thing.
Yeah, he's basically he's a non-believer who's basically saying we think by feeling, and he's a neurobiologist, and he's getting that from his practice as a neurobiologist. He's saying the amygdala is the place where it's the fight or flight present in the in the base of the brain. And he says that is where we are experiencing emotions constantly. And he said what happens is the processing of those emotions go on in the neural foreground of the brain. And he points, for instance, in one video that public broadcasting, PBS, shows a great video from a number of years ago, a man who had a stroke who had no access to what he was feeling. The amygdala wasn't being processed in his other neural sections because of a stroke that blocked the connection. So the practical application of that Damasio points out is the man could not make decisions. Because Damasio said decisions are based on our affections. And this is a book we looked at last week. We talked about this.
There's a great chapter in there.
So let me just read a little bit of James Peters here, The Logic of the Heart, Augustine, Pascal, and the Rationality of Faith, just to give you a taste of one scholar who is at a complex level, so this may not excite some of us who are going, wait a second, I'm just barely getting started here, don't dump me into the deep end. Here he's saying, modernity, modern times, zeal to free the rational individual from all forms of historical and traditional embeddedness has infected all the major institutions of modernity, the marketplace, the academy, the political arena, and the church. In the name of the right to forge one's own meaning and to improve the material condition, this is page 14 and 15 of this book in the introduction, to improve the material condition of human existence, modernity, the modern world, has severed individuals from community from nature, natural from supernatural, and facts as mere commodities from human values as mere private preferences. Following two writers, Hauerwas and McIntyre, these are Christian philosopher ethicists, I shall argue that those of us living in the so-called postmodern world, in which fundamental beliefs and practices central to modernity appear to have lost their authority and legitimacy, will suffer the consequences. Let me just pause here. Those of us in postmodernity just have the idea that everyone has the freedom to have their own point of view, and who are we to impose our point of view on others? So he's saying anyone that's adopted that will suffer the consequences of our disembeddedness until we recognize the extent to which both modernity and mainstream secular postmodernity foster a pervasive thesis of being disembodied, disembedded. The Logic of the Heart, this book, seeks to remedy this disembeddedness of our postmodern condition, acting as if history doesn't matter, by returning to the thought of two Christian thinkers of the past, Augustine and Pascal, whose perspectives on Christian faith and human reason provide us with a viable way to overcome modernity's unfortunate legacy of a deep and ugly divide between reason and affection, and postmodern's excessive preoccupation with its own gospel of radical autonomy. Whoa! So this is a book that goes on and chases that at a level of detail that's amazing, where he's basically saying, hey, what we love defines us. And we're kidding ourselves if we don't recognize that.
I think too is just that the sense of him making it clear that, well, here's I guess what the thought I was thinking of too when you're reading that is, and even Antonio Damasio, was Jesus says something very similar. And I think he beats them to it, which is in Matthew 6. He says, you know, where your treasure is, there is your heart also. And then immediately after that, he says, now if the eye is the light to the body, and what is attached directly to your amygdala is your eyes. It's how you see and perceive the world, and you're responsive. And if your eye is dark or your heart is dark, therefore now your body is dark. And if you think you have light, but your eyes and your heart are dark, how horrible is that darkness? And it's like, well, there you go. Postmodernity is a prime example of that.
Yeah, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. It's right back to the chaos of the book of Judges.
Yes, and so we think we have it right. But because my truth is my truth, your truth is your truth, and now we can go on, and you don't dare challenge my truth, or that is the worst sin of all.
Right. And it starts to actually break down real relationships, because everyone gets to be a little God. And pretty soon we discover we're desperately lonely. And a lot of young people are committing suicide. They're desperately lonely. There's no reason to live.
Or just real lonely, or even this sense is the fracturing of relationships. These kinds of things are even, you know, fracturing relationships, and they're on their own island by themselves now. And
let me read one more segment here of what Peters has had to write here. And this is on page 16. By insisting on reason's autonomous authority, this is the world of modernity, where reason trumps heart. So that would be going to the top set of circles in our two different versions of the soul. Independent of the sensibilities of the heart, the Enlightenment, that is the whole movement we call the Enlightenment, starting back with Descartes and others in the late 17th and 18th century, the Enlightenment inadvertently severed reason from the very source on which it depends for its own proper functioning. Similarly, by advocating the poetics of self-creation and extolling the freedom to construct our own worlds, mainstream postmodernism strips itself of its embeddedness in a world beyond mere human artifice, a world that has the power to bestow meaning and dignity on life precisely because it is not a mere social construct. Augustine's and Pascal's vision of passionate reason, quotation marks around that, provides a compelling account of our being embedded as humans and offers a viable middle ground between Enlightenment, rational autonomy, and mainstream postmodern poetics of self-creation. So in effect, it's saying, you know, going back to the heart is not to lose track of our mind or our sense of independence, but it's rather to orient both our mind and our sense of making choices within a basis that's rooted in the triune love of God. Well, anyway, we better wrap it up here.
We should wrap it up. I think we should just get off right now, Ron, because we have to get off and get back on.
I know it. Don't tell anyone.
All right. I'll see you in a bit, Ron.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.